So usually on a Sunday morning, since this is a gathering of believers, I address believers, right? So we're usually talking about some aspect of Christian belief or behavior or practice, something that's practical for us as Christians. One of the things, though, that I think is important to do every now and then is realize that that's not the gospel. Right? That's the message that comes after the gospel, after people have believed the gospel. And we dare not confuse it, because if we look at Christian beliefs and behaviors and practices and think, oh, well, that's what'll save me and make me right with God, that's a misunderstanding. And we miss the gospel. So what I want to do for the next few Sundays is go back a little bit, because we have the Lord's table coming up next Sunday, and I want to be able to tie the gospel into that. So I want to begin today and go back and look at the gospel and some aspects of what the gospel is. So we're going to begin in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 16. Paul had never been to Rome. He was writing to Christians that he did not know personally. And it appears that he was trying to address a problem there. And the problem appears to be that there were Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, and they weren't getting along. Right? They differed on observing holy days. They differed on what foods they should eat or shouldn't eat, and they were arguing with one another. And Paul, he's going to address that in chapter 14, but I really believe he builds the foundation for it in the whole book, because it's about what the gospel is about. And he says, for I'm not ashamed, in Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, or from faith to faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. It's about the righteousness of God. The gospel is dealing with the righteousness of God, where God is in the right. Of course, he has to declare where he's in the right, because we are in the wrong. People are in the wrong. And that's, in order to announce the good news, you have to have an understanding, a prelude, as it were, of the bad news. And the bad news is sin. And that's where Paul is going to go here in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. And we're going to spend most of our day on the prelude to the gospel, which is sin, and what that's all about. He says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. Now, the gospel reveals the rightness of God, but the problem with sin is its ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, places where men are apart from God and not in the right. The unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. In other words, they know the truth. There's something that is true and right, but they don't want to accept it. That's the problem in the world. We don't want to believe what God says is true is true. Instead, we suppress it, right? We press it down. We have an inkling that it's true, but we find a way to hide it, to suppress it, to dismiss it, to rationalize, to justify why it's not the truth, and to tell ourselves something else. That's the core problem, and that's the way sin operates. He's going to spell it out here in the next verses in Romans 1:19. For what can be known about God is plain to them. It's plain to humanity because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, the things that you can't see about him. No man has seen God. And yet his qualities, he says, his eternal power, his divine nature have clearly been perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. In other words, when I look out at the world, I should be able to see how amazing nature is. The beauty of a sunset, or the magnificence of the ocean, or even looking at the beauty of tiger stripes, or my own eyes or brain, or all of the amazing things, the ability of my body to heal, all those things that have been built into us, into nature. He says we should reason beyond that and say there's something greater than that thing that made it. But we don't do that. Humanity doesn't do that. What do? He says, for although they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. That's the problem. They didn't honor God as God. We didn't honor God as God. We de-godded God. God has a certain place as a supreme being that is reserved to him and that he has a right to because of who he is. And our problem is that we don't want to give him that place. It's that simple. We want to put something else in its place. Claiming to be wise, Paul says, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So this is pretty simple, isn't it? Right? If you look at the ancient world, most of the gods, most of the idols that they created resemble something in nature. Rather than look past nature, they looked at nature and said, this is God. Now, of course, we don't do that today, right? Actually, we do, right? The highest form of being awed in the world today is being awed by creation. Oh, I want to go out and I want to see a waterfall, or I want to see a great mountain, or, I want to experience looking at the stars out where there's no light, and people feel awe at that because, wow, I'm out in the world, I'm experiencing the world. And there are a lot of people who study the world, create documentaries about the world, and they are awed by nature and study nature and figure out how it made itself out of nothing. And we are awed by our own intelligence at being able to figure all of that out. And of course, if you try to say differently, you're a fool. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And they swapped places. Instead of the immortal God, the God who does not die, the God who has life in himself and grants life to everything, instead, we exalt things that die. And we know they die, and we watch them die. Even the things that we think are going to last forever, we now know are going to die. The sun is going to burn out someday, and that's not going to have a great effect on people on this planet if we're still here. Things die. The world's constantly dying. But God lives, and yet rather than look at the immortal God, we'd rather look at a mortal world and exalt the things of the world, including ourselves and our own wants. The gospel is designed to address that problem. The problem of us taking God off of the throne and putting ourselves or something else there. That's the central problem. Now, the problem is today, not everybody understands that. Like a lot of people, when they look at Christianity and what the gospel is, they assume, well, the gospel is supposed to bring about world peace. So we should be working for world peace, right? If you're working for world peace, you're working for the gospel. Or if you're trying to get rid of a problem, racism or poverty or human trafficking. See, if we get rid of those things, if we go on a crusade and fight those things, we're working for the gospel. Or maybe it's something as simple as personal psychological happiness. right? If I'm doing something that makes me happy and it makes other people happy and we're finding happiness, then we must be serving the gospel, and that's what God wants from us. And there's a lot of people and a lot of churches where that's what they look at. Those are the problems, and that's what we want to solve. We want to create social justice, and we want the world to be a better place. We want the world to be a happy place. We want to fight for progress, so forth and so on. I would submit to you, those are all wonderful things, but they're not addressing the central problem. And that's the problem, right? Years ago, and actually in the tropical regions of the world today, there's a disease called malaria. Right? And it's a cycling fever. If you get malaria, you get a fever and then it goes away, and then you get a fever and it goes away. And you can have this for your entire life, and it can be very debilitating. Well, the name malaria is actually from the ancient world. It's Italian. Mal, the root mal means bad, and aria means air, bad air. Malaria is about bad air. Now, the reason it's called bad air disease is because the ancient world noticed that people who lived in or traveled through swamps or wetlands often came out and had this disease, malaria. And so they assumed, it's caused by noxious fumes in the air. So you have to get away from the bad air, or you'll get malaria. So what they would do is they would move to higher ground, right? Ancient Rome did that. They started moving up out of the lowlands, away from the swamplands, and up onto higher ground. And they'd start building projects up on higher ground. And all of a sudden they found out, wow, nobody gets these fevers anymore. Nobody gets malaria. And they said, it's because we got away from the bad air. Same thing happened in Washington, D.C., right? They built it in a swamp, which is very picturesque in more ways than one. Well, early on, the Army Corps of Engineers realized, man, people are getting yellow fever, they're getting malaria. So they started building hills, artificial hills, moving people up. And then they drained the swamps down into the Potomac so all the water would run away, and so the bad air would go away, and there were no more rotting, lousy smells. And all of a sudden, people no longer had malaria. They did the same thing in New Orleans. Built a whole series of canals. People always got yellow fever and typhus and malaria. It must be the noxious fumes. And they drained the swamps, ran the canals, and all of a sudden, all of the malaria tended to decrease. And they said, we've solved the problem. Except they didn't. They still found that people would get malaria. And then in 1880, what they found was that malaria wasn't necessarily caused by fumes. It was caused by a little protozoum called Plasmodium that got into your system somehow, and that's what caused the fevers when it infected your cells. The problem is they didn't know how it got there. So they assumed, well, it must come from walking barefoot or dealing with your hands in damp, moist soil that smells bad. Or it comes from drinking water that came from these swamps and you ingested the protozoan. Or maybe you slept outside and breathed in the protozoan through the air. So they tried to avoid swamplands. And finally, 20 years after they discovered this protozoan, a British doctor discovered in India that the protozoan was delivered to you through the bite of an Anopheles mosquito. Now, you know what? For all those years, they thought, hey, we're doing the right thing. We're doing a great thing by building cities up on hills, and we're doing a great thing by draining swamps. You can drain all the swamps you want, and you can build all the high rises up on the hill that you want, but you're not addressing the central problem until you kill those mosquitoes. Right? The gospel is the same way. You can try to do world peace, but if you don't kill the mosquito of sin, if you don't deal with sin, if you don't deal with the problem that people's hearts are de-godding God, you're not really dealing with the problem. You're putting a Band-Aid on a cancer. The gospel is something different. Now, when we look at sin, sin does go off in a lot of bad directions, right? And Paul is going to give us examples of that. He says here, therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. When you take God off the throne and you put something else, yourself, your desires, your wants, when you put that on the throne instead, it is going to change your life. Notice it says God gave them up or gave them over. You know, God doesn't force anybody to do things that they don't want. God is a God of grace. And people say, oh, God judges sin and he brings all these wicked things upon us. Most of the time, the way God's judgment comes upon us is that our own sins punish us. And what does he do? He simply graciously gives us our way. He says, oh, you want to be in charge? I'll let you in charge. You don't have to listen to me. I will just let the fruit of your sin fall down on your head. I really believe that that's what hell is. Right? It's pictured as torture, but why is it pictured that way? It's pictured that way because it's awful torture from heaven's point of view. I think that people in hell are going to be just like they are today. They don't want anything to do with God. They want to be in charge on their own, and God's going to let them live that way for eternity. 1 million or 1 billion or 20 billion people in this place, each one thinking only of themselves, not caring about God, not having any reason to love anything other than themselves and their own wants. Constant conflict, constant battle, constant frustration every single day. No fulfillment, no joy, just an endless barrage of disappointing life that punishes you, that wears away at your soul. Can you imagine living this life, just this life, and this life still has the grace of God in it? Can you imagine living this life forever? I don't know that I could do that. I mean, I'm kind of looking forward to the day when I get to lay this body down and I don't have to deal with diabetes or, just weaknesses and frailties and colds and sore throats and all those types of things day after day after day. Heaven's going to be totally different. It'll be God's blessing. God lets our sins punish our sins. He graciously gives us over to them. But when he does that, it can get really ugly. Because when you take God off the throne and you no longer let him define what is right and wrong, what is good and evil, each one of us gets to define it. And we tend to turn things around because we don't really know which way is up. He starts with that description here in Romans 1:26. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. He's talking about homosexuality and lesbianism. When you go back and look at the created world, even if you forget God and you just look at it from an evolutionary biological perspective, you talk to an evolutionist and ask him what the purpose of life is. And you know what he's going to tell you? There isn't one. There's no purpose. The only thing that's remotely close to a purpose that we see in life is this, that life wants to reproduce itself. Right? Life reproduces life. And so that's kind of what they look at. Well, that matches the biblical picture, doesn't it? God made them male and female in in his image. And God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful and multiply. He made life to multiply. Well, what's this? The minute you take God off the throne and no longer care about that, he said, you no longer have the right perspective on sexuality. And so you go down this road in which you have a sexual relationship that doesn't have any capacity of reproducing. You're going against God and you're going against nature. What's the problem? The problem is that you took God off the throne. And you don't see clearly. Talk to people today and they'll say, well, I was born this way. This is natural. I'm not going against nature. This is natural to me. And they will reinterpret this passage to say, well, going contrary to nature means going contrary to your own nature. I think you can see in the context that's not what he's talking about. He's just saying that when you lose your compass, and you can make right and wrong, and the next guy can make right and wrong, we all can make our own choices and we can justify anything. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. Recently had a conversation with a young man, very intelligent young man, and really nice guy. And he had questions about Christianity. And he told me, he said, I don't think I can believe in God. And he said, I don't even believe in right and wrong, because he said, I believe that all that matters is our emotional reaction to things, right? So I see something that I feel is bad and I react emotionally to it. And I said, but if you think it's bad, is it wrong? He said, no, I just react in an adverse emotional way. And he said, we all react differently to different things. I said, so there's no right and wrong? And he said, no. I said, okay. He said, well, what do you think about that? I said, well, let me ask you this. Let's say I was serving you tea and I went out to the stove and I heated up a pot of water, boiled it, and I came in with it and I put the tea in the tea bag in front of it, but instead of pouring it into the cup, I poured it over your head. Scalding hot water. How would you feel about that? And he said, Wyatt, I don't think that'd be too pleasant. I said, yeah, but I think it'd be funny. I said, am I wrong? Am I wrong to feel it's funny? Am I wrong to laugh at your pain? And he goes, well, no. I said, really? I said, okay, let's say that you had a baby. Say you were married and had a child and you brought your baby and the baby was sitting here in a little seat and happily sitting there, and I took the boiling hot water and poured it over your baby. Did I do something wrong now? Or are you just going to emote against the fact that I scalded your child? And what if I think it's funny? Now, you understand I don't personally think that's funny. See, and we had a wonderful conversation about this. And I said, the reason I can't be an atheist is because I don't know anybody who can live consistently with what you're saying. I said, if you can't say that me pouring water over scalding water over a baby is wrong, I said, I'm sorry, my humanity can't relate to that. There's something built into the universe that tells me that's not funny, and it's not just that I feel bad about it, but that no person should boil a baby. And he couldn't say that. Now why? Why? He was struggling because he was afraid to see God on the throne. Because if God's on the throne, now it's not just And he and I talked about this. I said, so if you have an idea about something that feels good to you, and I feel the opposite is good, right? And I delight in scalding you and seeing your pain, because there are people out there like that, aren't there? Yeah. And we look and say, that's sick. But if you don't believe that there is something that can judge between your two opinions, it's not sick, it's just different. I said to him, it's like the Sith and the Jedi, right? The Sith are only evil if you're a Jedi, but if you're a Sith, the Sith are good and the Jedi are evil. It's two equals. And there are a lot of people who think, oh, well, that's how good and evil are. You know, it's just two sides that think differently, but they're both really good depending on which side you are. I believe that there's something above both sides that judges, something that's outside of each of the sides, something that's outside of me, and it decides what ought to be done. See, if he's not there, if there's no God there, if there's nothing up there telling us what is right and wrong, then my idea versus your idea, each one of us can say, well, I know what I want to do, but I can never say to you, you ought not do that. On what authority do I say it? Well, I don't like it. Oh, well, who are you? Are you God? Well, yes, that's what we think. And we think we have a right to be the moral compass for everybody else. And everybody else thinks they have the right to be the moral compass for us. And there's 8 billion of us, and all of our needles are spinning in different directions. And we're supposed to make sense of that. What a strange universe. And yet there's certain things inside of us that we know. We know we shouldn't pour scalding hot water over a helpless baby, or even over a friend, or even over an enemy. We know that's wrong. Why? Because there's something inside of us that tries to tell us that, but we suppress it. There are people that suppress it and make excuses for why it's okay to do those kind of things. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not be done. Something he says ought not to be done. Well, what kind of things do we do? Well, they're filled with all manner, notice how he says this, they're filled with all manner of unrighteousness. We're back to righteousness. Who's in the right? We do things that are wrong, but we convince ourselves they're right. We convince ourselves they're not wrong. Nobody's going to come out and say, yes, I am an evil, covetous, malicious person. I am full of envy. I love to murder and create strife and be deceitful and malicious. I gossip, I slander. I hate God. I'm insolent and haughty and boastful. I'm an inventor of evil. Disobedient to parents. That's really weird. Why is that in there? Talk about that in just a moment. Foolish, I am faithless, heartless, and rootless. None of us judges ourselves that way. Adolf Hitler didn't judge himself that way. Stalin didn't judge himself that way. Mao Zedong didn't judge himself that way. They could kill 6 million, 20 million, 60 million people of their own people. They could kill them and say, well, you got to break a few eggs in order to make an omelet. They could justify it. Complete cruelty. How did they do that? They suppressed the truth. They suppressed the truth. I'm going to find a reason to justify, to rationalize, to excuse. I'm going to change my terms around. I'm going to redefine words. Okay, we watch our press do it all the time. Right? My son and I were talking, and he asked me, he said, hey, Dad, did you hear about that earthquake over in Iraq or in Iran? And I said, yeah, I heard about it. And he goes, do you think it was an earthquake, or do you think we just blew something up there and they didn't want to tell us? I said, I wish I knew, but I don't know, because our media lies. They lie. They will lie right to your face. Oh, well, they'll print a little retraction on page 93, the bottom of the column, 2 weeks later. But they're not afraid to lie for their own agenda, to do what they want, because they don't want the truth on the throne. They want their agenda on the throne. This is what people do. And though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them. Now he's going to start shifting terms here. He's going to start shifting gears, moving to a different part of the discussion. Because everything that you just read there, you might look and say, oh yeah, if you're, like, let's say you're Jewish. And remember, this is a church problem between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, right? The Gentile Christians never had the law, never had circumcision, kosher food, any of those things, right? So when they became Christians, it was like, wow, their idea of righteousness, this is a whole new thing. But the Jews had always had the law. And the Jews who became Christians still respected that law, and they started being critical of Gentiles in the church because, well, they're not following the law. And we have the law. Well, we have God's law, so we're special. We're special. You understand, I'm a Jew because I have God's law and I received God's law. And now the apostle says, oh, you thought I was pointing to the Gentiles? Well, I was disobedient to parents in there. That's a weird thing in the midst of all of the murder, strife, disobedient to parents. That's one of the 10 Commandments. And you know what? Every single person violates that commandment. Every single one of us violates it. And we say, well, it's not that big a deal. Well, God says it is. It is. If you say it's not a big deal, you just took him off the throne and you put yourself there. Well, why is God being so petty? You just put yourself on the throne again. The Jews did this constantly because they loved to point out how terrible the Gentiles were, and yet all you have to do is go back through the Old Testament history and look, and they did all this stuff, including the homosexual stuff. They brought it right into the temple. They had male cult prostitutes that were made, men made to have relations with men to honor God. That's what they had. And the kings allowed it. And when the prophets preached against them, guess who got killed? The prophets. Oh, so you, Jew, you have the law, and you think you can judge everybody because you have the law. But he says, you not only do these things, but you also approve of those who do them. Therefore, you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges. See, that's what we like to do. We like to set ourselves up to judge. And whether we're using the Bible or whether we're using some other authority, we like to judge other people and tell them they're wrong and they're inferior and they're terrible, but we won't change ourselves. Okay, I love climate change activists, right? You know, oh, you should change your carbon footprint, they say as they step onto their big jet to take off to their next climate summit, as they ruin their carbon footprint. But see, they have to do it. I have to do it because I have to do it to save the world. But you shouldn't, right? That's just one example. It's hypocrisy. I say it's wrong, but I do it myself. And I find a way to excuse it and say it's not wrong. This is human nature. You're de-godding God. You have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself because you, the judge, practice the same things. We know that the judgment of God rightly falls on those who practice such things. Do you suppose then, O man, you who judge those practices, who judge those such things, and yet do them yourself, do you imagine that you're going to escape the judgment of God? You can justify it all you want, but you're still going to have to answer for that. You can lie to men. Are you going to be able to lie to God? If you call yourself a Jew and you rely on the law and you boast in God and you know his will and you approve what is excellent because you're instructed from the law, and if you're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. Do you think that's who you are? I love that he says a teacher of children. You know, I love to hear, and both sides do this, right? Whenever, in government, whenever their side is in, they say, oh, finally the adults are in charge, right? And what does that infer? It infers that the other type are stupid, naive children. And that's what he's saying. Oh, you think you're the instructor? You think you have it all together? You think you have all the answers? You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? They say, well, I don't commit adultery. Right? I have never cheated with another man's wife. And Jesus says, oh, did you ever lust after another man's wife? Because I tell you that if you have lusted in your heart after a woman, you have committed adultery with her in your heart. Right? He's not saying that it's the exact same thing. He's saying, look, you've got to understand what God is looking at. God is looking at your heart. And if you think you're right with him and you have these bad things going on in your heart, oh, yeah, you shall not kill. Oh, I've never murdered anybody. But I tell you that if any man is angry with his brother without cause, if any man calls him a fool or a jerk or a moron, and those are the words that are used, he says, you call your brother that? You've already got that problem of murder in your heart. You see what this is? The very first commandment in the scriptures is this. The very first commandment in the 10 commandments. You shall have no other God before you. But Paul says several times in the New Testament, he says that you don't want to be covetous because covetousness is idolatry. Covetousness is the last commandment. You shall not covet anything that is your neighbor. Paul says that's idolatry. Why? Because my wanting becomes my God. And now I've set myself and my wants and my perspective up on the throne, and I've taken God down. Now, this is what we struggle with. You who boast in the law, you dishonor God by breaking the law. You break the law outwardly and you cover it up and justify